How's my hair?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to an honest look. We're live. Your hair is great, Rick.
Thank you.
Looks
Thank
great.
you. Yeah, and Colin, hi Colin. Yours is
Hey.
just a little too perfect, okay?
Oh, I'm blushing.
welcome to the show, Colin. I want
Thanks
to
for having me.
introduce you properly, and then we're gonna jump into your story right after that. So, Colin is actually someone that I know that I met here in Brooklyn. He is the CEO of the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society. He's the executive director of Brooklyn Psychedelic Society. Their mission is to be a prototype of a psychedelic co-op, a community-based healing center that can provide safe, affordable journeys and programs centered around human well-being and flourishing. And then I'm gonna just let you get into how you got here, how you got to do what you're doing, and what drives your mission with this, with what you do. Just tell us a little bit what it all started. And welcome. So nice to finally have you on.
Yes, thank you, Fatih and Rick, for having me on. Really excited to be here and on an honest look. So, my background, my story, my origin story, I am from Syracuse, New York originally, and I had tried psychedelics a few times in college and had some very insightful experiences, but nothing that really had kind of stable changes to my regular sober life. So after college, I went to school at Northeastern and University in Boston, and then I moved to Syracuse, New York, just to kind of take a break from the college life and uh, be alone and read Nietzsche and live with my parents, as one does after college. And it's the first thing you're supposed to do. We all know this. And after year or two living at home, I was working at like a kind of a tech job, not really, sort of. But anyways, I got the unfortunate news. I got a phone call while at work one day uh, that a very close friend of mine took his own life, and he had harmed himself before and had tried like suicidal attempts before, but when I got the phone call on my friend, his former girlfriend told me that he was dead, I was like, "Oh, man," or there's like I thought he was, like, in the hospital or something, but no, he was gone, and it was a very difficult phone call, obviously. I was in a bit of shock after that happened, and I went to my coworkers, like, my friend died, he took his own life, and they were kind of in shock. Anyways, it was a lot, and then I drove home, got back, and then just bawled my eyes out after my found out my friend had died. Um So that was one of the first kind of, I would say, like capital T traumas I had in my life. I came from a pretty privileged upper middle class background in Syracuse, New York, but my friend who had died, his name was Eric, Eric Peterson. I'd known him since I was 16. So, and I was 23 when he died. So I'd known him for like 7 years, and for a pretty formative portion of my life, like late teens, early 20s. So he was kind of like an older brother to me. So losing him was, I think, the first real capital T trauma I had that kind of, yeah, really affected me for obvious reasons. So a few months after he died in April 2014. And then in June, so like 2 months later, I was invited to a rave in Syracuse, New York. So, as you could imagine, Syracuse is the epicenter of raves globally. Just kidding. So it was kind of a it was a pretty chill party. But I was offered some MDMA, and I thought I had taken it before, but after I tasted it, I'm like, "Oh, I don't think I've had this before." It didn't really work. At the time, I'll back up a second. At the time, I was still grieving my friend. It was only like a month and a half, 2 months later, and I was kind of being more experimental with drugs than normally would have been, just kind of more free flowing with it. And I took this MDMA, and it didn't really do anything at the rave that I went to. So then I went to an after party that was much more relaxed at someone's apartment nearby in the Syracuse University area. And not not super far from where I grew up. And I was given more MDMA. I took more, and then I felt something kind of shift in me. And then I felt like this rocket ship was taking off from within my stomach and going upwards. And I was just like, oh my God. And I just sat down on a couch on this porch that evening. It probably was like 2 a.m. It's a warm summer night. And I just processed so many, so many emotions from partially from Eric's death, but also just emotions and experiences and micro traumas I've experienced throughout my 23 years. Times when I've been bullied, times when I've been an aggressor, or been a bad brother, or not listened enough to people. Just so many, just very primal, intuitive kind of insights that seem obvious, but sometimes when we're caught up in the regular swing of things of our lives get covered over. So yeah, I felt like this ossified shell of armor that had been around my heart got melted away. And underneath that armor was this like all these emotions and things like that. But even underneath that, just a lot of love. And I felt in touch with like God again or love again, something outside of myself. Anywho, that experience, one more thing I'll say is a metaphor I've used is it felt like I had a filing cabinet on my back, and that in that filing cabinet was just folders of all this stuff that was bothering me that I had no idea. I had no idea I was just walking around with, and then I felt like I went through all of them and like, oh yeah, that, but that's okay. And anyways, that experience obviously ended because it's a drug. Stupidly, damn it. Oh, what? Yeah. Unfortunately, because I was a complete noob then in 2014 and I was 23, my friend's like, well, let's take some more MDMA at 5 a.m. after you just took some. And that's not how it works once your serotonin is depleted. So, anyways, I was like kind of just very frenetic and chaotic until the next morning. Anywho, that experience obviously went away, but it made like a lasting impression on me. And I felt like this black light was kind of shown over my heart, and all of these emotions and things I had forgotten about were revealed to me in a way I could not forget. And after that experience, a few weeks later, I think I had like kind of maybe a spiritual emergence of sorts where just something shifted in my daily life, my sober life. And I was able to listen to people a lot more easily and connect with people more easily. And just, I felt a lot more calm, like a pervasive sense of calm that I had not known before. And a couple practical examples of changes I noticed. One was my mom was yelling at me in the kitchen about something. And normally, when a parent's yelling at me, I'm going to like have an argument back or ratchet something up to sling back at them, this person who's taken care of me my entire life. Uh, I'll be an asshole back. I'll know what to do here. Yeah. Say something mean to this person who loves you incredibly. But in that moment, I felt nothing, no anger or frustration, but nothing but compassion for my mom, not just as my mom, but as a mother worried about her son hurting himself because he's grieving his friend who took his own life. And I saw this in this one instant in my kitchen, in our kitchen growing up. And I started to like just the combination of my mom and mother together, like this universal and this particular all in one, and just the amount of care I could sense. I didn't notice her anger or her frustration. It wasn't anger. It was just like love expressed in an angry way. And I started to tear up from the beauty of the just profundity of it was like seeing my mom for the first time in a way, which is, and I was sober. I was completely sober. I was just taken aback by this, like the beauty of her love for me and just mothers' love for their children. it's quite profound, and it's something, it's easy to skirt over at times. Anywho, I started to tear up from the beauty of it. And my mom just like looks at me like, "Are you crying right now? Why are you I'm just mad at you. Why are you crying, dude?" And I was like, "I just feel like a lot of love and compassion for you as my mom, and I think it has something to do with the drug I took a month ago." And she was like, "Colin, we need to get you help. Something is incredibly wrong with you. That's not what drugs do, Colin, okay? And you sound weird." Anyways, so that's kind of what something shifted in me. I remember feeling so simultaneously like elated from this change and an ability to empathize with people and to see things for the first time in a way, but also I felt like I was more fully able to grieve my friend because I a lot of this baggage I didn't know I was carrying with me was kind of like processed. And so I felt also just sad that my friend Eric couldn't have had a similar experience or didn't have the right setting for a similar experience. So uh I remember sobbing in my parents' bed one time because I felt elated and empathetic for life, but they're like, "What's wrong?" I was like, "I just wish Eric had a similar experience that I had had with this MDMA and this thing." And it didn't make sense to my parents. They were just trying to counsel me, but I felt in my heart that something with that MDMA like helped me. Like I felt like I was healed, but I didn't call it that, and I didn't know that was like, healing sounds like something that Dungeons and Dragons characters do or something, or World of Warcraft, something like that. But the idea that we can like healing can happen to a person, yeah, it it was kind of beautiful, but also sad because like my friend Eric didn't get healing. Like he had issues and difficulties and challenges, but he didn't get healing. So anyways, I'll kind of wrap this up so we can get back to the interview portion. But the how I got here to the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society was, well, I just started inundating myself, just reading as much as I could about psychedelics and the MDMA trials and thinking about like how it relieves trauma and can work on PTSD. And I felt like I had uncovered this thing that I didn't know much about, but that kind of gave a serious context to what took place with me. I'm like, okay, this is like legitimate. There's scientists studying this stuff. And it was in 2014, so it was still kind of pre-popularity of psychedelics, but yeah. So I eventually wanted to move to New York City just because I did an internship here in 2010, and that's the last time I spent a lot of time with my friend Eric, who died. He used to live in Brooklyn. He's from Scarsdale, New York. So he lived in Brooklyn for a little while. I lived here. And it was just like, I loved New York and I liked it more than Boston. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to get a tech job in Brooklyn or in New York City and move here. And I did that. And, I got some startup job, which I enjoyed. I was doing tech support for a while, but, I was still thinking about what was that experience I had. And I got into meditation since then, like Buddhism, things like that. But I was still trying to, that experience that I had, and I was still grieving Eric, obviously. I was like, there's something there. I don't know what it is, but there's something going on there. Anywho, that following summer in 2015, I think I was searching for like psychedelic groups or something in New York, and something popped up called the Psychedelic Society of Brooklyn, so a slightly different name. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I'll join that meetup group. And it was in June of 2015 in a park. And there was like 12 people, and we met and we talked about our psychedelic experiences and what, how we were affected by them. And at that point, it was started by my friend Danny Miller, who was a lawyer. And so, and he was a little more like by the books, and people wanted to share their experiences, but Danny wouldn't let people use the name of the drug One, because it was a different time, even though it's not that long ago. 2015, I guess it's almost a decade ago, is crazy. But even that, 10 years, you know, how much the cultural shifts has taken place around psychedelics. But it kind of made sense. Like, okay, I took something legal and then I talked to dwarves. It's like, okay, no, you didn't. Or yeah, but everyone was trying to, you know, keep it safe and not incriminate ourselves. But um in that setting though, at Brooklyn, it was Psychedelic Society of Brooklyn, I just noticed there was a need for like community building and like people organizing and events and stuff, which I've done before and had a knack for. And that gave me like an outlet for those kind of skills outside of my tech work. So anyways, after a year of being involved with the Psychedelic Society of Brooklyn, Danny asked if I wanted to take it over in 2016. I was like, yeah, sure, I'd be down and I'd be honored to. So I took over executive director in 2016. And at this point, it was still kind of like it wasn't like an organization. It was like, you know, we do some events here and there and things, but it was more like a meetup group. And so I changed the name to Brooklyn Psychedelic Society. Not a major shift, but kind of keeps it a little more contained. And then, yeah, that's my origin story, how I got into all of this. I'd be happy to talk more at length about future things and how we got to where we are now and all that. But that's kind of, yeah, friend died, had an MDMA experience, profound sober changes that stayed with me, that persisted, and then just a curiosity of trying to. Oh yeah, and another thing I'll say, in that time in 2015, the mid and early 2010s, there wasn't a ton of places for people to talk about their psychedelic experiences. Like that wasn't your family or your work coworkers think it's weird or taboo. So that's why these kind of psychedelic societies, which we are one of 110 around the country, that's why these kind of popped up, you know. So that's how those kind of they were still taboo, but not taboo enough to prevent people from meeting and sharing about them. Anyways, I've hogged a lot of the airtime, but that's my kind of origin story.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing where this all started with your friend. Obviously, I've been through loss myself, and it is not something that you can just, without the aid of psychedelics, like you are describing, it can take some time to go through. And I love that, the analogy that you made of this filing cabinet where like all these things were coming out and they weren't just related to this one specific loss, but like minor traumatic events throughout your life and things that most likely were left unprocessed, right? So it sounds like it really facilitated the processing of a lot of emotions that were stuck somewhere. Very powerful. I love that the experience that you had is quite remarkable, right? Within one evening, you were able to see so much that otherwise would take such a long time to go through in a regular like therapeutic setting with a psychologist where all our walls are up and the protection comes up and we're not able to perhaps feel some of those feelings. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like a very powerful experience that you have had. But also the fact that you were able to recognize that and got that curiosity started that got you like searching for more and searching for a safe space to have that, to share that, to be able to kind of look a little bit deeper into the potential of all of this, right? It just sounds like it kind of guided you down a path that it has the potential to create great impact, and it already is. I mean, I've been to some of these meetups, and I know how powerful they are, and how much people are really looking for a space to be able to share all of that, and to be able to have that is really, really important. So, just
yeah,
to say that.
And something I wonder too is like if I hadn't lost Eric then, and I took the MDMA at the rave, and maybe I had a good experience and felt connected to people, but I think the trauma of losing someone made the medicine more effective. It gave it something to actually work on in a way, because I think I think people can still have therapeutic healing experiences in a rave or dance setting. I certainly have as well. But what I'm saying is I do feel like I was a bit led along this path because I think I'm not trying to instrumentalize my friend's death, but I think there's a quote from a spiritual author I like, Richard Rohr, who Rick, you kind of resemble, I will say. You kind of just look him up after. Like, you do kind of have a mild Richard Rohr. It's actually uncannily similar. Anywho, Richard Rohr is an awesome Franciscan priest, and he says how God or love gets into people usually is either by great suffering or great love. And I think with my friend Eric dying was obviously great suffering, and this experience of MDMA was like great love. And I think that kind of is what catalyzes these sober changes.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Rick.
Well, I was good. Yeah, thank you for the compliment on that one. Actually, I think he's an author too, because I think I just read one of his books.
Oh, cool.
How serendipitous is that one? The what I find interesting, like, there's a couple of things that, like in my experience in coaching and sort of being involved in mindfulness for the last kind of 40 years. The one key thing that most people are always searching for is a peace of mind, a mind that is settled. And so often, other drugs are used, right? Alcohol, marijuana, heroin, and that have sort of detrimental immediate effects, right? Because what they're looking for is, I want this chatter, whatever this chatter, this feeling, to go away. And so there's that happens. What I find interesting with your experience with the MDDA is that although you had an immediate experience, there was something that appeared to be lasting, that there was a shift that happened that carried on, and you were able to see things differently in spite of the fact that you were no longer under that influence. So there was a shift in your consciousness that happened at that moment, but that shift stayed constant enough that you didn't have to go back into, like most addicts, right? They had the great high, and now they want to chase that high for the rest of their life. So they're always going back to the drug of choice. But in this case, you noticed something that didn't require sort of, quote, like another dose. And I find that fascinating because that is common in a lot of the stories that I hear of people doing what you did, from a therapeutic point of view, not from a recreational point of view. Are you finding that with your group as a common theme?
Yes, I would say so. Like, I do think some people do tend to, and I've been there myself, try to revisit that experience. And I think it does lose some of the magic or the potency when it's like sought after, rather than, it felt like I was not anticipating that experience. I had no expectations. I think I do notice tendency sometimes. I don't think this is a judgment on individuals, but more our culture is one of reusing things and instrumentalizing things and being addicted to things. So I sometimes have noticed people seeking out experiences with psychedelics, but they're very spaced. They're very spread out, and I don't think it's always a bad thing, but I think it's much different than it would be with someone who is using something like heroin or cocaine, like way different. But I do think a nuanced take is that there is sometimes a desire to re-experience the state. However, I will say, to your point, Rick, that people who I find, who in my opinion have a more grounded or maybe mature view of psychedelics over time usually don't end up tripping that much anymore. Like they kind of got what they needed, and they usually have like some form of like meditation practice or service practice or prayer practice or something. But the people who I know who I feel like have kind of gotten what they needed from psychedelics, they usually tend to not trip as much anymore because it kind of helped them reset their course in their life and gave them insight into where they kind of might fit in more. But then once you have that,
well, and that's the kind of the what I've been hearing too is one of my practices is that we all already are whole, right? We already have built-in resilience, our an unlimited capacity for love. Like it's just our thinking that removes us from our core. And from what I'm hearing from other people is that the drug itself enables you to separate the two, and enough that you get to see sort of this true essence. And yes, that when you have a glimpse of it, like once you see it for what it is, like like when you get the insight, you can never forget it. The hook is thinking, yes, the drug precipitated the experience, like it gave you sort of like a jump start, right? But it wasn't necessarily where you would sort of relating to like a lean to towards, well, I have that's the only access I have is to go back into it that way.
Well, can I add something to that? Because what I observed in my personal experience of hearing people sharing, and kind of to Colin's point, like once you have had this experience and you see things that you can no longer unsee, right? There's this crucial piece that I know Colin is also working on of integration of the experience, right? Oftentimes people that go back to the experience have not integrated that experience, those insights properly, right? And so they go back to their habitual selves, they go back to the habitual way of thinking, and over time that gets wired back in, right? So in order to be able to implement your insights, implement the changes that you want to make about yourself, let's say, you're going to have to integrate that, take some specific actions for that to happen, right? The medicine, I like to call it medicine versus drugs, by the way, because I think it's more appropriate nowadays with all the knowledge that we have of the potential, the therapeutic potential of it. So the medicine helps you see things more easily. But now once you're out of the experience and your brain is functioning in a normal way, now you still have to go and do things to implement that, take action, create new habits, right? But you have a clearer picture. You're being able to, like you're saying, disconnect yourself from your thinking and have this like observer's view, and and want to go and implement this. But oftentimes what I notice is that people go back and seek the experience because they haven't been able to implement the changes or create that transformation within themselves. And so if you have done that kind of work, like to Colin's point, you don't really need to go and seek that kind of experience, as often. Also, because it takes some time to integrate. It's they can be kind of heavy to process sometimes as well. And Colin, please feel free to add to that.
Yeah. I agree with both your points. Could you? I think I understand Fatih's book. Can you share what you were saying, Rick, in a nutshell? Because I think there's an interesting difference in what you guys are saying. That's what I'd make sure I remembered what you had to say.
All I'm basically saying is, like in sort of layman terms, we have this thing called the ego, and if it's our basis, our true core, our self, our authentic self, let's say, that experience of our authentic self is removed by the ego thinking, like the egotistic side of things. And what I'm hearing from other people is that, and how you describe your experience, is that that was removed temporary enough for you to rest in that grace of your authentic self.
Right.
And to Fatih's point is, now that you've had this wonderful experience of who potentially you are, and now you're back in, and I love your term, sober life. It's sort of like, well, now what, right? And then you had this other experience where I didn't react like I would normally react, because you had that insight earlier. You might not have connected, but you noticed that there was a shift in the way the ego would have triggered a response immediately.
Right.
So you had that sense of, oh, I am not my ego, I am not my thinking. Like, then who really am I? And that's a wonderful question to keep asking yourself, right? Because there's a lot of Buddhists and other spiritual teachers that say, keep asking that question, who am I? Keep asking. Keep asking. And I see other people are commenting, but the point I kind of want to say, once you level up, you can't forget.
Yes.
Right. So you had that experience. The trick for me is to understand that you have leveled up to the point, and to your point, when you go back in to take another drug or have another session, it's not the same. Well, it could never be the same because you've leveled up.
Yeah. Okay. I think I agree with that. And I think you're both interestingly sharing two very important aspects of the psychedelic experience. And one is one of being, and one is one of becoming. I think what you're saying, Rick, is like when we kind of have an insight into our ontology, our metaphysics as like a self, it's like it's not just our mind. Like our mind's a part of it. But our mind needs to be like kind of secondary to our heart or to our awareness of love. And then, so that's like who we are. That's our being. And then to Fatih's point, I'm hearing like, how do we actually set ourselves up for a process or momentum towards actually becoming that which we really are? Like integrating, having community support, having rituals or accountability groups or coaches or things to support living in a way that's in accordance with what has been kind of shown.
Yeah,
Uncovered. Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I'm thinking, because that's how I think of it. Like I think we have these spiritual insights, like metaphysical insights, and it's such a grace for people to be able to like, oh my gosh, I'm not just the things I've done wrong or like things that have been happened to me or traumas I've experienced that have been inflicted upon me. That can be a very elating insight, but then having their life set up in such a way as to inculcate those insights, not even about those insights, but now that I feel this way, I'm liberated from more fears and small-minded thinking, to actually I'm supposed to be like a piano player, or I actually want to re-engage with my family with whom I'm estranged or something, and then there's this interesting article I read recently about, I actually did not read it, but I'm familiar with the contents. I browsed it. I didn't peruse it because apparently peruse means a detailed reading of something, which I didn't know. There's a metaphysical insight for you. We've been saying peruse wrong. Oh my god, this just in, the Honest Look podcast. Yes, there's a mind bender. Anywho, I browsed this article quickly and I found out that, well, set and setting are common concepts in the psychedelic space, and there's also Matrix, and not the fantastic sci-fi movie, but set is like your mindset going in, setting is like the environment you actually participate in the ceremony, take the medicine in. Then your matrix is, what is your social connections like, and do you have someone to support you, or like an accountability partner? Do you have a therapist? And I think set and setting, there's a lot of great material on, but I think for the most part, it's more or less settled. Like, look, just have like a calm as much as you can. Like, be educated on what you're doing, if it's safe, all that. Have a kind environment, etc. Obviously, there's more to it but that's kind of figured out. But the matrix, the culture, and the container for what actually leads people to go through a metamorphosis, much like a caterpillar to a butterfly, that's something that I think needs to be created. And that's, I think, what we're doing here at Brooklyn Psychedelic Society is, indigenous cultures, it's often shared in the psychedelic space, rightfully so, that indigenous cultures have been using psychedelic medicine for millennia. I do notice the number of years always increase, much like when people talk about psychedelics, like it felt like 5 years of therapy in one night. It felt like 10 years of therapy in one night. It felt like 40 years of therapy in one night. Like, that sounds like a little too much therapy. That sounds like that's like how many past lives were like, yeah, I was Colonel Mustard and I realized, anyways, the point I'm making is, you guys asked for jokes, so I told a few. Please stop and just get to the point. Just please focus. Indigenous cultures, when people, I'm no anthropologist, and obviously indigenous culture is kind of a Western idea to begin with, because it's like, is it Native American? Is it Aborigine? It's like there's different cultures that refers to. But when they would take the medicine, that culture has a context, a cosmology, a language, and a community local to that culture. And the matrix is built in there, And in our culture in the West, it's very postmodern and pluralistic. There's Christians, atheists, shamans, and I don't think the solution is, let's try to find one universal thing that fits every single person. But I do think it's about creating containers for people who are trying to work on similar things, like trying to find their vocation, trying to get over negative self-talk, or trying to rehabilitate a relationship with their family. And, it doesn't need to be some major cosmological context that everyone abides by, but like, what are we trying to like work on? And that's what we're kind of trying to pilot here. I'm genuinely not trying to pivot back to BPS, but though I think that's where we need the most creativity and thoughtfulness around, is the right cultural containers for transformation.
I mean, I think the work you are creating with BPS is really important work. So I would love for you to actually talk about that, because that is where people are going to be able to find that support system that's going to support their growth, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, we can all do it in hiding, right?
Yeah.
Like kind of wing it, or we can all kind of compare notes and like find people that are, like-minded and are working on the same things and are there for us, support us in moments where we may need that, right? Mm-hmm. And so I really love what you're pointing to. Setting are the two things that are often spoken about the most, even in, in all the studies that there have been. But like your actual environment, right? And we talk about this a lot as coaches normally, right? That when you enter your normal environment is your life, right? And if whether or not that environment is supportive is actually crucial to your ability to be able to transform and implement those changes, right? So it's kind of like the same thing within the psychedelic world and within that kind of context and work, right? So why don't you tell us a little bit more how some of the ways that you...
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So to go back to my origin story for a second, my friend Eric came from a pretty well-off family. They had resources, so he he had, to my knowledge, he had like psychiatrists, therapists. He was able to go to rehab centers. He struggled with drug addiction at times. He was a very talented, gifted, charismatic artist who had a lot of difficulty like loving himself, as many of us struggle with at times. I think artists sometimes especially, because they're kind of vessels for the muse and the divine. But anywho, that can be a big burden. So he had access to traditional containers for healing in our culture. And for those just listening to the podcast, I'm doing healing in air quotes because I think our mental health system is more so based around like treating acute issues and traumas, or like treating the symptoms of things rather than their causes.
Yeah.
The causes. So that's one way to kind of boil down how our current system works, and how we are currently delivering or planning to deliver psychedelics at scale across the country is more so through a medicalized or traditional therapeutic setting approach, which I think is better than not doing. That's great. I think that should be still pursued, and I think for acute issues it'll be the main. It's necessary to have that. But what I think has been taking place in indigenous cultures for millennia and in psychedelic societies for a couple decades is a process that we currently lack a container for. So, like, that process, I think, is community-based healing, and that's what's taking place. But we lack a cultural container for that. So what do I mean by a cultural container? A cultural container is a kind of a context where a process can get kind of really distilled down and like kind of harnessed, but then it helps enhance that process, and the process enhances the container. So for example, where do we go to like drink coffee? We go to cafes. Where do we go to get fit? We go to the gym. Where do we go to recover from alcoholism? AA. Like there's these cultural containers for that. Obviously you can get fit, you can run in the forest or do whatever, but a gym kind of like harnesses that process. So I think where you go for psychedelic transformation will be psychedelic co-ops. And a psychedelic co-op is a community-based, democratically governed healing center that offers journeys alongside cohort-based programming focused around human well-being and flourishing. So that's what we're trying to be a pilot for that model. So if we can make that work here, then any community-based organization, whether it's a psychedelic society or let's say like a community of colors, like we want to have our own healing process and a container for that. Like, oh, well, here's a model we philanthropically test it out so you can also use. So that's our kind of role as a nonprofit, is to prototype the psychedelic co-op model. And then our hope is that psychedelic co-ops will do for community-based healing and transformation what libraries do for books one day. And that there'll be a nationwide network, hopefully maybe global, of psychedelic cooperatives. And I think eventually it won't even be just psychedelics as the main modality for catalyzing growth and change, but it'll be one among many. So that's our kind of mission. And yeah, working on the process of community-based healing. The process is community-based healing, and I can elaborate on that if you'd like. And then the container that delivers that process is a psychedelic co-op. Much like at a gym, the process is fitness. It could be weightlifting, running, personal training, combination of thereof. But the gym is kind of the cultural container for that. And how I like to continue with the gym metaphor, if someone comes into a gym and they're like, I want to get fit, but they have a bone sticking out of their arm, it's like, well, you actually need to go to the hospital right now. But I heard on the Honest Look podcast that the gym is for
Yeah,
the process is a cultural. No. Just we need to get you immediately to the hospital. Like similarly, if someone comes in to a psychedelic co-op and they are suffering from acute trauma, like sexual trauma, or they were in war or something, you know, they were a veteran, like, well, that might be better suited for a specialized one-on-one or close, you know, more focused acute care rather than a community environment, at least at first. So I think the psychedelic co-op model isn't meant to compete with or like, you know, nay the more medical approaches, but I do think for most people, much like gyms or like libraries do, most people will get their healing and transformation, I hope, through psychedelic cooperatives, and if they need it, can go to those more specialized approaches if needed, which people will. So, yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Absolutely.
I know in Canada they've opened up a lot of psychiatrists are now exploring that avenue for their the chronic things, right? Because they, like you said earlier, so much has been focused on the symptoms and not on the cause.
Right.
And because they're starting to notice this immediate shift in people, like they're starting to look towards, okay, so what are we missing? What have we been missing all these years? Every drug that we have ever come up with to help with mental illness or mental health is supposed to be temporary, and yet here we have people years and years taking these things, and then all of a sudden something like this comes along, and it almost seems like, well, I hate to use the term, but it's magical, right? There's something magical about it, right?
Compared to what we have. Right?
Yeah.
No pun intended, right? Yeah, but I was gonna go some really crazy places here, but the
I think it's magical. I don't think it's literal. I think it's how the natural world happens to work. And,
absolutely, but
yeah.
that is what mystifies and almost scares people, is because they can't, it's an illusion, it's magic, but I can't explain to you exactly how the trick works.
Right.
Because on the medical side, they want that. They want the definitive explanation and the understanding. But when you're talking about something that is basically formless, where do you point to it? Where do you point to where you had your experience? Right? Because it doesn't seem like it's an eternal experience, although you are experiencing it in some way.
It's an experience that's hard to just explain unless you have the experience, right? Because it goes beyond what we normally perceive with our normal perception, right? It puts us in a place where like parts of our brain are not as loud as they normally are. So it's difficult to explain that to someone that hasn't had that experience. Well, their brain is
it's very quantum physics, in the sense of it's only through the observer that you see the change.
Right.
And traditional psychology, we see the change we see the symptoms in a very physical form. And so that's what we're dealing with, because I can see, oh, you have anxiety. Well, here's something to take care of that for you.
Yeah.
And now that you see, I see a behavioral shift, so obviously that it must be working. So but I love your concept of, and also your insight around that it's not size. There's a side of it, and I can see that where people that are really having tough times, like your friend, could go to a therapist or a psychologist who has this part of his toolbox that recognizes that here's something, let's in a controlled environment, let's see what happens, and then take it the next step where, okay, now we have this sort of, call it maintenance, or how do we integrate it now into the real world with a community group like yours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You did cut out for a second.
Yeah, I noticed that. We seem to be having internet little.
But I think I caught the gist of most of what you were saying. Another thing I'll say is I agree the psychedelic experience is like hard to quantify, and it seems like a quantum mechanics are sort of just so different than our usual experience kind of way. But I do think it is similar to when we like fall in love with somebody or really take to a new friendship or a new hobby that really like helps us, like a new hobby that's like, oh, this is a part of me that I haven't been in touch with, you know? And I think it's almost like it's a literary way to describe these experiences in like a poetic way. I think is more apt for describing these than a more scientific or, you know, materialistic way, which can be useful, obviously. But the main point I'm making is that I think part of the challenge and what needs to happen to make psychedelic medicines much more accessible and transformational for society is developing a way of talking about these things that make sense and can be shared. And yeah, I think, you know, we've only been doing this for, you know, half a century, if that, in the West, you know, since like the 60s, and then indigenous cultures for a much longer time. But we can't just, we're obviously not indigenous. We can't just like, oh, let's just export what they're doing. That could be extractive as well. Don't want to do that either. But anywho, developing a nomenclature for these experiences and ways that emphasize and facilitate transformation, I think, is part of this work as well.
Absolutely. I love what you equated it to like falling in love, or it's like it's that connection with love, right? With that openness, with that ability to fully feel. Because that's what it took me back to when you referenced that, like when you completely surrender yourself to someone and open your heart to that person.
Mm-hmm.
There's a level of trust and knowing in that I would absolutely equate to the psychedelic experience. This knowing, this feeling safe and open. That it's, it can be very challenging to feel otherwise.
It can be, and a lot of people in the psychedelic space, myself included, at least for a time, were people are very interested in like Eastern meditation and Buddhism and Vipassana and Zen. And that kind of contemplative practice is usually centered around like concentration and like clearing the mind, which I think can be very beneficial, obviously. It sounds like, Rick, maybe that's an aspect of your coaching, perhaps, like helping reduce the chatter. What's interesting about psychedelics is that, well, there's another form of meditation in the Christian tradition, and it's more accurately called like contemplative prayer. And in the Christian tradition, it's a receptive form of meditation. It's where you are, if you believe in there's a higher power, God, a loving God that loves you and wants you to be your fullest potential in God's eyes, then putting yourself before that and just being receptive to that. It's, in other words, it's a relational form of meditation. And I do think psychedelics, that modality is, I think prayer is kind of a more apt, not that we are praying to the psychedelics, but we're kind of engaging in a conversation with this intelligence, a plant intelligence, even if it's synthetic. I've had this experience with acid and MDMA as well, but I think a receptive it's one of receptivity. It's a form of like contemplative meditative practice that is receptive rather than concentrative, I think. Not that concentrative practice can't have utility before, after, or during the psychedelic experience, but I think prayer is a useful kind of analogy for what takes place.
Interesting.
I love that. Yeah. So I'm seeing that there were a bunch of questions here in the chat, but I was also reading that perhaps some of the questions were answered. So just to clarify to our audience, we talked about MDMA specifically because that was Colin's experience, but when we refer to psychedelics, we also talk about magic mushrooms, LSD, mescaline. There's like different forms of psychedelics. And I feel like Carol answered your question in regards to, like psychedelic guided therapies where psilocybin, magic mushrooms are being used. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of actually research on that specifically. Was there anything else, Don, that you wanted to ask, or do you see anything in here, Rick?
No.
Like Carol had a question up here, actually. How do you understand, here, let me bring it forward. How do you understand the mechanism of action of the various substances in expanding access to altered states of consciousness?
Understand the mechanism of action. I guess I would say I do not understand that. The mechanism of action, that sounds like a pharmacology science-y thing, which sounds legit. I've heard mechanism of action before. So I'm personally not as familiar with how psychedelics work in the brain. I probably should a little bit more than I am. So you caught me, Carol.
Well, I mean, in general, they just lower the volume on part of your brain, and other parts of your brain act.
Yeah.
Right. To just answer this very general.
Do you think yeah. So I see. Maybe she's asking, like, how do they work? Like, how does it lead to altered states in a nutshell?
That's the way I'm interpreting this.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
A little confusing. Yeah, that's how I would
understand that. Well, I don't. There is serotinogener. I can't say it. Basically, things that work on the serotonin systems and then the dopamine systems. This, I feel like Carol was planted here by a friend of mine. Just see how scientifically illiterate I am. The serotonin system and the dopamine system are where they usually work. So this famous chemist named Sasa Shulgin, wrote two well-known books in the psychedelic world called TCAL and PCAL, and oh man, I hope I don't get ousted in the psychedelic community for butchering what those stand for. But PCAL, I think, is phenethylamines that I have known and loved, and then the T one. Oh, this is Carol really threw a curveball. I think T is like tryptamines.
Yeah.
Is that it?
I think so. Yeah.
Anywho. Some work on the serotonin system. I think those are the two general classes of classic psychedelics. And technically, if they don't fall in that one of those two categories, they're not technically considered psychedelic. So like ketamine is a dissociative, and MDMA there's a more technical term for how it works, but phenomenologically it's like an empathogen. It's not technically a psychedelic because it doesn't work. It's not a tryptamine or a phenethylamine. So it doesn't work on those two systems. But psychedelics they've been, it's really, psychedelics, I think now colloquially refers to substances that induce an altered state of consciousness that, if used correctly and safely, can be helpful for healing and insight and transformation. So I do know how MDMA works, which is interesting. Like, it basically floods your brain with serotonin, but then also the parts of your brain associated with fear and anxiety are turned down to a very low degree, and not turned down where like you would like put your hand in fire or like start, doing something dangerous like that. You're still very lucid and you have your wits about you. But then parts of your brain associated with like love and feeling safe and compassion go way up. So you're basically just not really afraid of stuff, and you feel safe, and you also feel like a lot of love. Like, you can think of someone you really don't like, or that was your bully in high school, and you'll feel a lot of compassion for that person. Yeah. So unfortunately, that might be the extent of my
That's perfectly fine.
pharmacology
We're not a
knowledge. Yeah.
scientific podcast, so that's
Thank God.
Yeah.
Well, that was a good question, Carol. Sorry I couldn't answer it more thoroughly.
well, we're gonna be having more conversations about psychedelics coming up, and we'll get more into the details of the sciencey stuff. But like, there's so many different parts to this, right? And the work that you're doing is about delivering it, how to have the most impact in the community, like on a community level. And I think that's super important, right? Because the details of the science behind it are relevant, but really what is going to create the impact and that transformation is to create those safe spaces for people to be able to experience this and process and integrate and create true transformation in their lives, and overcome trauma, and move stuck emotions, and all of the things that we discussed today. So
Yeah.
just wanted to put the focus back on that, because I think for the average person, that's really what matters, right? That's really what we are looking for. So
Yeah, and I think psychedelics are challenging us to create new cultural institutions and practices and business models in order to actually fully harness their transformational potential for society. I think we lack, like I'll be a broken record here, but we lack a cultural container for these medicines currently. Like, people are doing them and they're having their experiences and they're getting benefit from it, but we need a cultural container for actually facilitating this process. And I think it's psychedelic co-ops, community-owned, democratically governed healing centers. I think having the democratic component part of it's really important, because it keeps the kind of aims and ends of that community on its members flourishing. And as we've seen with like traditional medical approaches, with pharmaceutical approaches, people can take a medication for their entire life,
right.
and I'm not knocking that. Some that can be very helpful just to get you on your feet. However, how psychedelics work, I think, optimally, is they give you an insight into, they help you heal and they give you insight, but then you actually need the support and the infrastructure to walk the walk.
Right.
And after that, it's kind of like, well, you kind of already learned what you had to learn. I don't think getting a reminder every now and then is, that could be helpful. But once you kind of know, as Ellen Watt said, once you get the message, hang up the phone. But creating a cultural container and practices around really allowing those insights to blossom, that's what I think the work is that's got to be done. So
And also continuing to have these types of conversations to really normalize and destigmatize what's the culture that we've been in around psychedelics for so many years, right? It's been a taboo topic. I know that is changing, but the more we shed light onto this, the more we share the information, and the more we speak to the benefits and the potential of it, and the more we help really shift the conversation into accepting that this is something that is calling us to pay attention to and to put our weight behind, because the benefits have been proven to be extremely relevant and powerful. So listen, it's been over an hour. I can't believe it went by so fast. And as we close this up, I was just wondering if there's something that you wanted to add to conclude it, if there was something that we should have asked you that we didn't ask you, or if you're just done with us.
I'm not done. I have one more thing. Yeah, one more metaphor that I've really, first of all, thanks for having me on, Rick and Fatih. It's been really enjoyable. I appreciate this.
Thank you.
It's been great talking to you guys. One metaphor I kind of want to leave you guys with and your audience with is a trellis. And this is actually the name of our community healing modality that we are going to be launching hopefully sometime in the next few months through Brooklyn Psychedelic Society. But if you think about what a trellis is, it's a gentle support structure to help a plant grow. And it's not imposing or coercive. Like, it's not trying to turn a strawberry into a broccoli. But it's also not absent. It's there. It's gentle, but there. So from organizing in the psychedelic space for 8 years here in New York, I do notice people, I think, have genuine insights into who they are, their path, things they need to work on. But the support needed to actually get them there, that's lacking. So a trellis, if you think about a trellis, someone might see themselves as a fully blossomed rose, but in actuality, they're kind of still in a bud stage then. And the trellis metaphor is like, it's a gentle support structure to help people gradually blossom, and it's rooted in community. So that's our kind of way of thinking about community-based healing. And I think this is a helpful metaphor to think about. Like, because one thing psychedelics do not do a great job in is time. They don't give you an accurate sense of time. Everything seems like, oh, you can change tomorrow. And it's like, you can get in some trouble like with that. I certainly have. So I think trellis metaphor is also helpful because it's like patient, gentle growth, human blossoming, human flourishing. So
it's a great metaphor.
Yes, I'll just leave you guys with that. Thank you so much for having me on. This is super enjoyable.
Absolutely. I've been waiting for this for a while. I talked about this a while ago. Thank you so much. I love that metaphor, and I agree with you. Sometimes we can just really already be there, right? But we haven't built what it takes for us to get there. Right? We're still where we are now. We just see it much more, it's a lot easier to see it through the psychedelic experience. So I love that you're leaving us with this. It's really, it's really important, piece to be aware of. So I am sharing your website, your links with our audience. Get in touch with Colin if you have any questions. Come to the meetups if you're in New York City, if you're interested in this. They're very informative. There's all sorts of it's not just people talking about journeys, but it's very, very informative. I've learned a lot from it, and I want to thank you for creating it, for allowing me a space to come and learn about all of this, for coming on today. And I'm sure we're going to do this again, right?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Looking forward to having you on again. So I'm just going to post in the chat your links. This is going to stay on YouTube, Facebook, wherever this is going live. And then the podcast is going to drop in a couple of days. So Thank you so much for being here, Colin. Thank you, everyone,
and share this episode. If you found some value in it, share it. Support us so we can bring super guests like Colin and others in this. So subscribe to our channel, like it, share it, make comments. Love comments, even the ones that challenge us, right, Colin? But that's where it comes from. Like my party message is stay open, stay curious, stay open. Don't come to conclusions. We would never have this had this conversation 15, 20 years ago. right?
5 years ago, maybe even.
Well,
right?
maybe, right? But I am very, very thankful that it's being more upfront, and we're just having a natural conversation about it. Nothing very open, very, nothing secretive. Oh, you did what, kind of a thing. So yeah, thank you, Colin. Really, really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Rick. Thank
Right,
you, Fatih.
share it, help us amplify our impact, support us, and support the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society if this is something you're interested in. And we'll see you next week.
Bye
Ciao.
now.
Bye, everybody.